Hi, good morning and welcome to our live stream here. You can probably guess what we're going to talk about. It was a pretty big night and morning. Of course, I'm talking about the blockbuster deal sending Sergi Ibaka to Orlando. But also there was this Brexit thing happening. So we want to talk a little about it, and together with me is here in New York Brian Shaitkin, a senior economist at the Conference Board, and from our offices in Brussels we have Andrew Tank, Executive Director for the Conference Board, and Ilaria Maselli, you are a senior economist at the Conference Board, relatively new, and good to have you on board for this major event happening in Europe. So, Ilaria and Andrew, so what actually happened last night? What legally and actually happening or will happen in the near future?
Okay, let's start with the simple questions. So there was a referendum in the UK, and it was about deciding whether to stay or to leave the European Union. Now, as you have seen, the decision was to leave, with 52% of people voting to leave and 48% to remain. So it was quite a close call, but still a clear enough vote. And the consequence of that is that the UK will leave the EU, and the Prime Minister Cameron this morning announced that there will be a negotiation that will start. He proposes that it starts in October. There is a whole process foreseen in the European treaties for that, in the famous Article 50. So the process is that he formally notifies the European Council about the fact that the UK wants to leave, and from then there is a period of 2 years of negotiation. What is not clear is when the clock starts counting, because Cameron proposed this morning that this will be the job of the next Prime Minister. He will resign at the end of September or beginning of October, and so it will be up to the next Prime Minister to announce to start the procedure, the divorce procedure. However, the reaction this morning from the President of the European Commission was that they would prefer the process to start sooner than that, actually as soon as possible. So there is a 2-year period for the negotiation, to summarize, but we don't know exactly yet when this starts, and we will only know it probably beginning of next week, because there is a European Council.
And this is where the clear rules which Ilaria spelled out, this famous Article 50, which is a rule enshrined in a treaty that the United Kingdom has signed, collides with the very strange British political system. In a technical sense, this was an advisory referendum on which the government has to act. The strange thing is, though, that the majority of parliamentarians were supporting the Remain position, and the British people has now decided to leave the European Union. So in political terms, the next step, the Prime Minister has said he will resign. So the first thing to happen is that there needs then to be an election for a new leader of the Conservative Party. That person, whoever it will be, will then automatically become Prime Minister as long as he or she can maintain a majority in the Houses of Parliament, which is likely. And so the negotiations which we're talking about will then be led by that new Prime Minister, however long that takes, whether it's 2 years or not. There's a number of uncertainties there, not least who that person will be, but also there may be other changes in British politics which will also come into this. The leader of the main opposition party, the Labour Party, a man called Jeremy Corbyn, there's been a no confidence vote against him as well. So it's possible, in fact, we will have new leadership across the political parties. And the head of the Scottish Nationalists has announced that she will now bring forward legislation to be discussed, whether there's another referendum for independence of Scotland within the European Union. So there's a lot of things going on, Gad, at the moment, and uncertainty.
Before we get to the future, Andrew, as probably our listeners could tell from your accent, you are from the United Kingdom. So, what do you say? So, on the one hand, we have a lot of commentators who are saying that this is one of the worst self-inflicted wounds in the history of politics. But why did the citizens of the UK decided to do that, in your opinion?
In my opinion, Gad, I think there's a short-term answer and a long-term answer. I think the long-term answer is that the British people have always viewed their membership of the European Union in a very transactional way. It's been to access a single market. It's had primarily an economic impact, in contrast to most of the other peoples in Europe who viewed it much more as a political project to bring peace to Europe and to make sure that the French and the Germans could get on well. So the long-term picture is that the British have always been reluctant members of the European Union and participated because it was in their interests, but there wasn't the emotional engagement. The second then comes into why this referendum happened and why the result was as it was. I think my view on that, why it happened, is because the Conservative Party has been very split about Europe. Some people have been arguing that we should leave for a long time. Others have seen economic benefits. The referendum was brought to resolve that problem. During the campaign, there were really two competing issues. The economic case for remaining was very clear, and the IMF, the leading experts, basically said that the economic case was very robust. On the other side of the argument, the big case for leaving was concerns about migration and concerns that living standards, particularly among the poorer people, were being undermined by excessive migration. And so there was a real competing arguments there. The Leave campaign adopted very emotional arguments. They had some charismatic leaders, and they continued very strongly on this line. And that, against the advice of all the experts, is what the people listen to more.
Mm-hmm. Ilaria and Andrew, what are the main benefits that Britain obtained through membership in the EU, and how are they going to try to maintain those in the upcoming negotiations, and to what extent might they be able to do so?
Another easy question. Thank you, Ryan. The benefit of the EU, the main benefit of the EU is summarized easily in the four freedoms. So in the EU, there is freedom of movement for workers, goods, services, and capital. So once the UK leaves the EU, it will lose access to the four freedoms, to the four freedom of movement. So this has direct implication on, there are approximately 3 million EU nationals living in the EU, of which 2.1 million working, in the UK, not in the EU. So Europeans that work in the UK, and then there are 3 million British people that live in a European country that is not their own country. So this decision will immediately affect them, for example. But then if we move to the business side, there is a huge impact on basically every firm in this continent which has some sort of relationship with the UK. And this can mean importing things, exporting things, having the headquarters in London. A lot of the non-European firms that want to access the European single market have their headquarters in the UK, a lot of them. So for business inside and outside Europe, the big question is, okay, what do we do? What do we do now? Do we move? Do we wait for the negotiation to see where this goes and whether we can still have access to the single market? Do we move to another country in order to continue having the same access? So this is This is the concrete impact of the decision.
And that plays out at very many levels. If we think of the world of business, on the first level, there's the whole question of foreign direct investment, and that's particularly relevant in relation to manufacturing industry. The UK motor industry, for instance, which suffered a lot and declined a lot in the 1970s, was revived by foreign investment, with first of all Japanese companies and then German companies investing in the UK so that they could export to the rest of Europe. That will become much more problematic, as Ilaria says, if they don't have freedom of access and they have to pay tariffs, for instance, on importing cars from the UK to the rest of Europe. The second major area, which is of probably even more concern, relates to financial services. Because within the single market, banking, insurance, all sorts of other fund management services can operate throughout the European space. Once Britain is outside of the single market, those mutual recognition things would fall away. And so these, Brian, are very much the sort of negotiating points which will come in this 2-year period. How much of those can be maintained? What will be the cost of maintaining them, and so forth?
And I think the service sector is really important because it's really the specialization. The financial sector is really the specialization of the British economy. So the UK imports a lot of goods from the rest of Europe, and of course exports financial services. So the whole sector, which is really the key sector in London, will have to understand how to continue operating. And there is one additional difficulty. It's a very technical point, but it's a major point, that UK banks can access the European payment system. So even though the UK is not a member of the Eurozone, obviously, the banks can register payments that happened in the Eurozone with another central bank of another Eurozone country. But this is a privilege of only countries that are in the EU or in the European Economic Area. So once the UK is out, it will lose this access, which is really important to operate, because I think something like 20 or 25% of the transactions in the UK are euros.
Correct. Yes.
So I think the issue that Ilaria and Andrew described around the financial sector illustrates one of the tensions at the heart of how is the EU going to approach these negotiations. Because on the one hand, so much of economic activity throughout the EU is in some way wedded to financial transactions that happen in London. So there's going to be an incentive to ensure that there's minimal disruption to those transactions. On the other hand, some EU members, particularly, I would say, France and Germany, may view this as an opportunity to poach some of the UK's financial services sectors and try to see if perhaps Paris or perhaps Frankfurt can become the new center of European financial services activities. There are various challenges to both alternative locations, but that same tension is going to exist across a lot of other industries where the EU is going to have to decide between disrupting activities and maybe gaining a competitive advantage by, in some ways, limiting UK access to EU markets in certain ways.
Right.
Yeah, I think that there's a general point you're making there that the whole European economy since the single market has emerged as a unified supply chain, so that products and components, services and goods are very much intertwined. By the UK leaving that zone, all those things become much more problematic.
So I think in light of those kind of long-term impacts of this decision, What do you think is going to happen in the next several months or several days even? What will happen to the global economy, to the UK economy, to the US economy? What will happen to business confidence, and any other thoughts you have on that issue?
Okay, I start. As you might have read in the statement, we have tried to understand what are the potential channels for the propagation of a hypothetic shock. So I start, let's say, smaller and then get bigger. The first shock, it's surely to the British economy, and it happens through two channels. One is the labor supply, and the other one is trade. So on the labor supply, the important thing is to make sure that Europeans can stay, because if European leaves, the risk of labor shortages is gigantic in the UK. Now, there is no need to panic, because as long as the divorce under Article 50 is not complete, the UK is a member, and as a member has all the duties and all the rights of a European Union member state. So it will not happen overnight, but it is important for the economy to make sure that these people can stay, because they really support enormously the British economy. Doctors, Uber drivers, financial analysts, you name it. So this is one channel, the labor supply. The second channel is trade. As we said, the UK imports goods and exports financial services mainly. Now, when it comes to trade, it's always very easy to negotiate tariff barriers. You just bring them down. There is actually, in the West, among the Western economies, very, very few tariff barriers. But the very nasty thing to negotiate is the non-tariff barriers, so the standards, the quotas. And when it comes to finance, this becomes particularly important and difficult to negotiate. So the second channel could be this part of trade that becomes difficult to tackle. And it will take a long process. This will probably take the full time of the negotiation to figure out. Then there is the third channel that we outline in our statement, and the third channel is confidence. Now, confidence is global, it's a global issue. It's not only about UK, it's not only about UK and EU or the Eurozone, it's really global, because we have seen the volatility, the huge volatility on the financial markets in the past 24 hours, basically. It went up enormously and down. Now, of course, the financial markets tend to over-amplify the reactions all the time. We have a clear memory of it with Brexit last year, with the spreads in 2009. So they over-amplify, but they give the signal that, there is a lot of uncertainty, and this uncertainty can push two things in the wrong direction. One is the dollar that appreciates, and the appreciation of the dollar, you guys can perhaps explain what could be the consequences better than us. And the second one is a delay in investment. So if any firm was planning to invest, to take advantage of the low interest rate, to change the capital, to buy new equipment, etc., this decision might be delayed by waiting, to see how the negotiation goes, maybe the results of the presidential elections on your side of the world. So these two, confidence and delaying investment, can have an important impact on the world economy, and this, I think, what everyone is worried about now.
And I think, to add to those is the political anxiety and concern. I talked earlier about the UK situation. There's talk now of a second Scottish referendum. There's all this uncertainty about who will be Prime Minister. And again, markets hate uncertainty. So that political anxiety in the UK is big. There's also, and maybe even more significant, potential political impacts elsewhere on the continent. There's a number of separatist movements in the UK. There's a number of opposition politicians who've asked for referendums in their own country. The leader of the National Front in France has called for a referendum for France. Now, were France to leave the European Union, that would be a real major, much more significant event than what we're talking about today. So all those political repercussions in countries big and small across the European Union are going to play out some of those get in the next few days and weeks, and some certainly in the next few months. All of that is going to add to a sense of political uncertainty, which, again, markets don't like. As Ilaria said, it tends to postpone investment decisions. The animal spirits of investors tend to be much more cautious. Yes, they'll certainly look elsewhere in the world, but the implications of a stronger dollar is not going to help American exports, and so the repercussions trigger around the world.
And Brian, speaking of the US, what do you think will be the impact, the short-term and maybe longer-term impact on the US economy?
So the short-term impact is you're going to see a decline in consumer and business confidence, not so much immediately because the U.S. is so reliant on trade with Britain, but simply because this is a signal that populist political movements are gaining strength globally, and indeed, we of course have an election coming up in November. We have our own issues right now in terms of populist political movements. And as a result of that, that creates a certain level of perceived business risk. So I would expect we've already seen investment, non-residential investment fall over the last 2 quarters. It's anticipated to have risen somewhat during the second quarter, but I would say as a result of a softening in business confidence, you're likely to see non-residential investment fall back into negative territory in the third and fourth quarter. On the other hand, consumption has remained reasonably strong. The housing market is also remaining fairly strong as household formations increase and purchases of single-family homes rise. So as a result of those two factors, I don't think we're going to see a near-term recession in the U.S. I think the housing market and personal consumption can support the economy enough to avoid that scenario. However, we'll probably be revising down our growth forecasts modestly.
And I would also say that with the strengthening of the dollar, that means probably more bad news for the manufacturing sector that has been under pressure for over a year now. Brian, Andrew, Ilaria, any final thoughts before we conclude this live stream? Anything we didn't cover? Things that our listeners should pay attention to?
Not really. I mean, it's clearly a news that people were not expecting. The market certainly were not expecting it. I think all of us are absorbing the implications. They'll play out over a long time. There'll certainly be turbulence in the next few days and weeks. And then as the negotiations go, I think the thing to watch is the extent to which this is a rational, reasonable negotiation based around interests, which, as Brian suggested, makes sense for everybody. You know, Britain's the 5th largest economy in the world. It makes sense that a sensible trading relationship is established. The extent to which that's rational and the extent to which the political and emotional issues start to come to the fore, and particularly these rather ugly nationalisms which are coming up across Europe, which could take us in another direction. One straw in the wind is that the one person who's welcomed the news today about Brexit is Donald Trump. So that's to make of that what you will. Ilaria?
Yes, well, I'm also curious to see, and I honestly don't know what will prevail in the negotiation, whether it would be a very pragmatic one based on the fact that, we need to keep working together because our ties are really close. And this, I spoke to our members in the past couple of weeks about this, and they were kind of confident that in a way the mutual interest of doing business will prevail in the negotiation. at the same time, I mean, for me, there were a lot of lessons from the Greek experience. And, if the council wants to make this like a bloody negotiation to scare everyone to take the same path as Cameron, they will. They can make the life of the next prime minister really miserable. So I really honestly don't know what will prevail between the two. So I'm curious to see.
Yeah, no.
At the same time, I really have the feeling from being in Brussels that this is the day one of something new. And if it goes in the right direction, it's a massive wake-up call for European leaders to deliver a better Europe. If it goes bad, it's nationalism everywhere. And there, it's a snowball effect, country by country. So let's see what the future will deliver.
A question from the videographer here. Is there any likelihood of a scenario in which the short-term pain is so much that the electorate kind of does a U-turn in the way that it seemed to happen in Greece? That basically the result, just the shock is so much that they have another re-referendum or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's very, very unlikely. And the margin, although it's only 52 to 48, that translates into something like 1.3 million people more voted to leave than remain. So, it's a decisive result, this. This is something that's been talked about in British politics actively since the last referendum, which was in 1975. No, I don't think there's any chance that the referendum will be run again. I think the question then becomes, in the negotiation, how loose or how tight is the link between the UK and the rest of Europe? And I think that, as Ilaria said, is still very open. And at some stage, whoever becomes the Prime Minister and has to lead those negotiations will have to make compromises. Those compromises will certainly disappoint many of the electorate who'd hoped that they would take control and they would have all this freedom. In fact, of course, they will discover that there are constraints which every leader has to have in any integrated modern world. So I think if there is a real economic downturn, Britain, there's any realistic chance that Britain would rejoin the European Union. And of course, having left, it would be very hard for Britain to rejoin. Certainly not in a generation.
I wouldn't agree there, Andrew. I wouldn't agree. I bet in 20 years there will be another application and it will be accepted for the best of everyone. But I think, let's see, if in 20 years we meet again at the table and talk about it. But I think the parallel between the Greek referendum a year ago and this one this year, I mean, it's extremely interesting to observe how entertaining and passionate European political discussion is becoming, because a year ago we were all expert about Greece, now we're all expert about Brexit. Let's see what comes next. But it's a very different situation, because in Greece the referendum was called basically within 2 weeks. It was announced 2 weeks before it took place. And there was a question which was not really, do you want to stay in the Eurozone? It was a question about the bailout program. Whereas the question now on staying or not in the EU was clear. It was announced months ago, and during this month, I would have to say, there was a good discussion in the country. I don't appreciate the rhetoric of the Leave campaign, because I watched some debates and I have to be honest, they were lying to the face of the people. In many cases, like literally. So there was this post-truth discussion from their side, but at the same time, all the arguments in favor and against the EU have been listed, have been discussed deeply, and at the end, people decided not rationally based on their gut feeling. But it was a fully democratic exercise, and so it has to be respected.
And also, there's unlikely to be a short-term reversal that would occur during the negotiation period, simply because the likely next Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, will have come to power on the basis of leading the Leave campaign. So it's difficult for me to imagine, unless the economic situation becomes far more dire than we're anticipating, that it will end up triggering a new referendum before the UK leaves the EU.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, of course, what the leader of the Scottish Nationalists is now talking about is possibly having a second referendum in Scotland before the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, with the idea being that if the majority of Scots people vote to become an independent country, they would then remain within the European Union, and then the rest of the United Kingdom would exit. Now, again, this is uncharted constitutional territory. It's never happened before, so we don't know how that would plan out. But that is certainly one possible scenario, that when the time comes, in fact, Scotland, which voted to stay in by a high majority, by about 60-40, I think, would stay, and England, Wales would leave. Many other scenarios. There's also the question of Ireland, where again, in Northern Ireland, the majority voted to remain, and the Republic of Ireland is very concerned about the implications of this. And again, there is talk among nationalists for a vote to unite Ireland. So, there are many of the issues which have been dealt with over the last 100 years in the British Isles, which are coming to a fore because of this.
Andrew,
Yeah.
Andrew, one other uncharted constitutional scenario that I'm curious about, if this is even a possibility, what would be the provision if the people of London were to vote in favor of becoming independent from the UK? Is that something that could theoretically happen?
Well, of course, the strange thing about the United Kingdom is that it has no constitution. There is no written constitution. So, all these laws are based on a series of practices and precedent and so forth. So, there's no description for how that would work. No one's ever talked about independence for London, although if you look at the map, London was one of the strongest areas for Remain. So certainly, in terms of sympathy, the people, particularly in inner London, are very integrated with Europe, very comfortable with multiculturalism, and very pro-European Union. I think it's unlikely that they would be able to draw a boundary around themselves as an independent country in the way that obviously Scotland could.
Mm-hmm. Ilaria, can you speak up?
You mentioned Ireland before, and I wanted to say something. I think Ireland is in a very interesting position now, because of course, the Irish government was in favor of Remain, no discussion there. But now that Brexit happened, they are those that can benefit the most, perhaps, because the country is growing a lot. So the country was growing enormously. It's like the poster child of Europe that passed from the 70s being one of the poorest countries in Europe to being actually one of the richest, fastest productivity growth, like an economic miracle. Then Ireland was strongly hit by the crisis, more than the average of Eurozone. So the contraction of GDP was really strong in Ireland in 2009, 2010. But then the country started to grow again, more than the average of the Eurozone. And now they're really in a favorable economic position. Productivity is the fastest growing in the Euro area. And I would say that if I was an American company and I had to choose to relocate somewhere, I would probably choose Ireland, because there is a lot of foreign direct investment coming from the US already. The country is very well run. It does well. The corporate taxes are low. So if I was a business person, I had to take this decision in the coming 6 months. It's Dublin I would look at as new.
I think that's a very interesting point. And of course, this is one of the paradox of modern Europe, that the lingua franca in finance, in multinational business, and even at the European Commission itself is English. That is the common language. And this is where, of course, Ireland really scores, because it is an enthusiastic pro-European country which uses the English language, is receptive to foreign investment, and I think that's absolutely right. I think.
How is your French, Andrew?
Could Dublin become a financial center under this scenario?
It's already a significant financial centre, nothing like the scale of Frankfurt or London, but at the moment it is rather sort of an offshore financial centre. It could easily take on some of those jobs. And obviously, why do people like working from the City of London? It's obviously the agglomeration effect of a lot of banks together, but it's also because it's a nice place to be culturally. Dublin has that as well as a location.
Larry, can you speak just generally, like constitutionally on the continent, how the tradition of having referenda like this, just coming from the perspective of the United States, where we seem to need a supermajority to pass a budget. The fact that this came so suddenly, that this major change could happen just with kind of a simple vote. Is there provision for that in other countries like France and Italy?
Well, every country has its own rules.
Yeah.
But we have seen quite a few referenda in the past years. So, for example, something like 10 years ago, there was a big discussion on having a European constitution, so to have a better set of treaties to rule the continent, which was seen as a big step in European integration. And then this constitution was put on for a vote. And it was rejected. It was rejected in France, which was a big surprise, being one of the founding members of the European Union, a traditionally pro-European country. So there is a referenda. There is a tradition to call for referenda, but of course it changes in every country according to the rules, the national rules. But what is important is that it's a bit of a dangerous habit to call referenda on this type of decisions, because whenever people have the chance to vote, they don't vote on the specific issue that is discussed in the referendum, but it's more a vote on Europe in general or on their own leaders of the moment. For the sake of democracy, if you can have a referendum like the one in the UK, where there was a really good discussion for months, then it's a good democratic exercise, despite the negative result this time. But this was not always the case in the past. So, for example, there was also very recently a referendum in the Netherlands on whether the EU should go on in this treaty with Ukraine, for trade with Ukraine, and it was rejected. And again, it was a too specific issue to be discussed with the referendum, I think, because then the vote was against the government or against Europe in general. So as long as it can be nicely done as in the UK, it's a good exercise, but this was not always the case.
And of course, I think, the UK, clearly it was a democratic process, and also the issues which people were voting on were not strictly just about Europe. Many of the people who voted against Europe were really voting against their own personal circumstances over the last few years. Many of particularly the working class voters in poorer areas have suffered from declining public services and some sort of the pressures which they face, which they put to blame on the European Union. So again, it was other political issues which affected them as much as them.
Also, I think the way Europeans feel about Europe is always in a way filtered via the government of that country, in the sense that a lot of times the prime ministers from any side, left or right, they tend to blame Brussels for a lot of things, because it's easy, to just blame someone else for the problems you cannot deal on your own in your country. So Brussels is always, judged extremely severely by the European citizens. This is not to say that reforms in the governance, for example, are not needed. They definitely are. 100%. And I hope this is an occasion to start thinking seriously about that. But people are not always fair, I think, towards the EU.
Okay. Well,
Wow.
thank you very much for this live stream. I think those who listen to us gained a lot of insight and from your expertise. So,
And if anyone listening to us has a comment, has a question, type it into the comment field now, and we'll give it a few seconds. Any final questions, Brian?
I think at the end of the day, the number one thing to keep in mind is that this is a very exciting event, and it's going to move confidence around the world in quite profound ways. But as Ilaria and Andrew have repeatedly made the point, I think this is very important. We really do not know what Britain's future relationship with the EU will be, and that's going to determine a lot about how severe any Brexit-related downturn in the UK economy will be, and also the shape of European economic activity going forward. So this is a situation where the fallout simply will not be obvious right away.
okay.
Okay.
So, after we finish here, we can talk about the Sergi Baka trade, where I think the implications are clearer. So, thank you again, and hopefully we'll do this again soon, probably under better circumstances. Thank you, and
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
bye.